Good evening, dear friend. Come now, settle yourself gently into comfort and let the weight of the day fall away like leaves drifting to the ground in autumn. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about shadows and secrets, about two organizations that operated in darkness while the world above them went about its daily business. This is a story about the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States and the Committee for State Security of the Soviet Union, known by its Russian acronym as the KGB. These two organizations faced each other across an invisible battlefield for nearly half a century, gathering information, recruiting agents, conducting operations that most people never knew about. As you rest here in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and steadily, let yourself drift back through time with me, back to the years just after the Second World War ended, when the world was reshaping itself and when these intelligence agencies were first taking form. The year is 1945, and the Great War that consumed much of the world has finally come to an end. Europe lies in ruins, its cities devastated, its peoples exhausted by years of conflict. In the Pacific, Japan has surrendered after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing an end to the fighting but introducing the world to weapons of unimaginable destruction. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, an unlikely partnership between the democratic United States and Great Britain on one side and the communist Soviet Union on the other, is already beginning to fracture. The common enemy that held them together is gone, and now the deep ideological differences between these allies are becoming impossible to ignore. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the world in those immediate post-war years. Much of Europe is occupied by armies that had liberated it from Nazi control, and these armies represent the two emerging superpowers. Soviet forces control Eastern Europe, having pushed the Germans back all the way from Stalingrad to Berlin, occupying Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. American and British forces control Western Europe, having landed in France and pushed eastward to meet the Soviets in the middle of Germany. This division of Europe, meant to be temporary while the continent recovered, would become permanent, creating what Winston Churchill would call an Iron Curtain dividing the continent into two hostile camps. The United States emerged from World War II as the world's most powerful nation, its economy strong, its territory untouched by the devastation that had scarred Europe and Asia, its military forces unmatched in their capability. But American leaders understood that military strength alone was not sufficient to protect American interests in a world that was growing more complex and more dangerous. During the war, the United States had operated an intelligence organization called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which had conducted espionage and sabotage operations against the Axis powers. The OSS had proven valuable, but it was disbanded shortly after the war ended, leaving America without a centralized intelligence capability. President Harry Truman, who had succeeded Franklin Roosevelt after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, recognized the need for a peacetime intelligence organization that could gather information about potential threats to American security. In 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act, which created several new organizations to coordinate American defense and intelligence efforts. Among these was the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which would be responsible for gathering intelligence about foreign governments and organizations, for conducting covert operations when necessary, and for providing analysis to help American leaders understand what was happening in the world. The CIA was born into a world that was already dividing into hostile camps, and from its very beginning it was focused primarily on the Soviet Union, the nation that American leaders increasingly saw as the greatest threat to American security and interests. The Soviets had a different political system based on communist ideology. They had expansionist ambitions that threatened American allies, and they were working to develop their own atomic weapons, which would eventually give them the capability to strike American cities with devastating force. Understanding Soviet intentions, capabilities, and activities became the CIA's central mission, a task that would occupy the agency for decades. The Soviet Union had its own intelligence services with a much longer history than the CIA. Even before the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Russian Empire had maintained intelligence organizations to monitor internal dissent and gather information about foreign powers. After the Bolsheviks took power and established the Soviet state, they created intelligence services that would become increasingly sophisticated and ruthless. The first Soviet intelligence organization was called the Cheka, established in December 1917 to suppress counter-revolutionary activities and protect the new communist government. The Cheka and its successor organizations, which went through various names and reorganizations over the years, served two main functions: internal security, monitoring Soviet citizens to prevent dissent and opposition, and foreign intelligence, gathering information about other countries and conducting espionage operations abroad. By the time World War II ended, Soviet intelligence had evolved into several organizations. The NKVD, which had been responsible for both internal security and foreign intelligence during the war, was reorganized in 1946, with its foreign intelligence functions transferred to a new organization. In 1954, these various Soviet security and intelligence organizations were consolidated into the Committee for State Security, known as the KGB. The KGB would become the Soviet equivalent of the CIA in terms of foreign intelligence operations, though it also retained extensive internal security functions that the CIA did not have, including monitoring Soviet citizens, controlling borders, and suppressing dissent within the Soviet Union. As you rest quietly, breathing slowly and peacefully, imagine these two organizations taking shape in the late 1940s and early 1950s, each one reflecting the society that created it. The CIA was part of a democratic system where intelligence activities were supposed to be subject to oversight by elected officials, where there were at least theoretical limits on what the agency could do. The organization was staffed initially by people who had served in the OSS during the war, adventurous individuals who had proven themselves in dangerous situations, along with academics, lawyers, and business people who were recruited for their expertise and their commitment to defending democracy against the communist threat. The KGB, by contrast, operated within a totalitarian system where there were few meaningful constraints on its activities. It answered directly to the Communist Party leadership, particularly to the General Secretary who held ultimate power in the Soviet Union. KGB officers were selected for their political loyalty as well as their competence, trained in specialized schools where they learned tradecraft, languages, and the ideological principles that were supposed to guide their work. The KGB had enormous resources at its disposal and operated both within the Soviet Union, where it maintained an extensive network of informants and surveillance, and abroad, where it conducted espionage operations against Western countries. The fundamental difference between the CIA and KGB went beyond their structures and methods to the societies they served and the values they represented. The CIA operated in a society that valued individual freedom, democratic governance, and market economics, though the agency itself sometimes acted in ways that contradicted these values. The KGB served a system based on state control, one-party rule, and centrally planned economics, a system that saw dissent as treason and that used intelligence services as tools to maintain power both domestically and internationally. This ideological divide would shape how the two organizations operated, what methods they considered acceptable, and how they justified their actions to themselves and to their leaders. Both organizations understood that they were engaged in a competition that would be fought largely in secret, through espionage and covert operations rather than open warfare. The development of nuclear weapons made direct military conflict between the superpowers too dangerous to contemplate except in the most extreme circumstances, so the Cold War would be fought through proxy conflicts in other countries, through diplomatic maneuvering, through economic competition, and through the secret work of intelligence agencies. The CIA and KGB would become the primary instruments through which the United States and Soviet Union tried to understand each other's intentions, to gain advantage over each other, and to influence events around the world. The early years of the CIA were marked by a steep learning curve as the new agency tried to establish itself and develop effective methods for intelligence gathering and covert operations. The CIA's first major challenges came in Europe, where Soviet influence was expanding and where the United States was trying to prevent additional countries from falling under communist control. The agency recruited former German intelligence officers who had worked against the Soviets during the war, tapping into their knowledge and their existing networks in Eastern Europe. The CIA also began developing its own networks of agents and informants, people who could provide information about Soviet activities and intentions. The KGB, meanwhile, was building on networks that Soviet intelligence had established during and even before the war. Soviet intelligence had been remarkably successful in penetrating Western governments and organizations during the 1930s and 40s, recruiting agents motivated by communist ideology, by money, or by personal grievances against their own governments. Some of these agents had provided valuable intelligence during World War II, when the Soviet Union and the Western Allies were fighting together against Nazi Germany. After the war ended and the alliance dissolved into rivalry, these Soviet agents continued to operate, now providing intelligence that helped the Soviet Union understand American and British capabilities and intentions during the early Cold War. One of the most important Soviet intelligence successes of this period involved atomic espionage, the effort to learn American and British nuclear secrets so that the Soviet Union could develop its own atomic weapons more quickly. Soviet intelligence recruited scientists and technicians who worked on the American and British nuclear programs, people like Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project and who passed detailed information about nuclear weapon design to his Soviet handlers. This espionage accelerated Soviet nuclear development significantly, allowing the Soviet Union to test its first atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The revelation that Soviet spies had penetrated the nuclear program shocked the United States and contributed to a period of intense fear about communist infiltration of American institutions. This fear manifested in various ways, including the controversial investigations led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who accused numerous government officials and public figures of being communist agents or sympathizers, often with little evidence. The McCarthy era, as it became known, created a climate of suspicion and fear that affected both American society and the CIA itself, which had to investigate its own personnel and carefully screen new recruits to ensure they were not Soviet agents. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, you can understand how the stage was being set for a long confrontation between these two intelligence organizations, a confrontation that would play out in dozens of countries, that would involve thousands of intelligence officers and agents, that would sometimes turn deadly, but that would more often consist of patient intelligence gathering, careful analysis, and quiet manipulation of events behind the scenes. The CIA and KGB were entering into a competition that neither would win decisively but that both would wage relentlessly, a competition that would shape the Cold War and influence the course of history in ways that most people never fully understood. In the years immediately following World War II, as you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, Europe became the primary battleground for intelligence operations between the CIA and the KGB. The continent was divided between East and West, between communist and capitalist systems, and this division created countless opportunities and necessities for espionage. Both the United States and the Soviet Union needed to understand what the other was doing in Europe, what military capabilities they were developing, what political intentions they held, and what vulnerabilities might be exploited. The Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe through a combination of military occupation and political manipulation, installing communist governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and East Germany. These governments were nominally independent, but in reality they took their orders from Moscow, and Soviet troops remained stationed throughout the region to ensure compliance. The CIA faced the difficult challenge of gathering intelligence about what was happening in these closed societies, where Soviet control made it dangerous to operate and where the KGB maintained extensive surveillance of anyone suspected of working with Western intelligence. The CIA's approach to Eastern Europe in these early years involved trying to build networks of agents who could provide information from inside communist-controlled territory. This meant recruiting people who lived in Eastern Europe or who traveled there regularly, people who had access to useful information and who were willing to risk their lives by spying for the West. The CIA sought out military officers who might provide information about Soviet forces, government officials who could report on political decisions, scientists and engineers who could reveal technological developments, and ordinary citizens who simply kept their eyes and ears open and reported what they observed. Recruiting agents in Eastern Europe was extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The KGB and its sister services in the Eastern European countries maintained extensive networks of informants, surveilled foreigners constantly, and dealt harshly with anyone caught spying for the West. People who agreed to work with the CIA knew they were risking not just their own lives but the safety of their families, who might also face punishment if the agent's activities were discovered. Despite these risks, the CIA did succeed in recruiting some agents motivated by opposition to communism, by nationalism, by religious faith that conflicted with the officially atheist Soviet system, or sometimes simply by the money that the CIA could provide. The KGB, meanwhile, worked to recruit agents in Western Europe who could provide information about NATO military capabilities, about American nuclear weapons stationed in Europe, about political developments in Western European governments, and about CIA operations and personnel. Western Europe was more open than the East, which made it easier for Soviet intelligence officers to operate, to make contact with potential agents, and to gather information. The KGB could operate under diplomatic cover, with intelligence officers working officially as Soviet diplomats, trade representatives, or journalists, positions that gave them legitimate reasons to be in Western countries and that provided some protection from arrest. Soviet intelligence was particularly successful in recruiting agents within the British intelligence services during this period, penetrations that would not be fully discovered for years and that provided the Soviets with extremely valuable information about British and American intelligence operations. These Soviet agents within British intelligence, who became known as the Cambridge Five because several of them had been recruited while students at Cambridge University in the 1930s, included Kim Philby, who rose to senior positions in British intelligence and who had access to highly classified information about British and American operations before his treachery was discovered and he fled to the Soviet Union in 1963. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the patient, dangerous work of espionage in these years. Intelligence officers on both sides spent years developing relationships, gaining trust, identifying potential agents, and slowly, carefully approaching them about working together. A typical recruitment might take months or even years, with the intelligence officer meeting the potential agent multiple times in innocent-seeming social settings, gradually assessing the person's motivations and vulnerabilities, testing their reliability with small requests before asking them to provide classified information or to conduct espionage activities. The CIA and KGB both established stations in major European cities, with intelligence officers operating under diplomatic or commercial cover, pretending to be embassy staff, trade officials, or business representatives while actually conducting espionage operations. Vienna became an important intelligence center because Austria was occupied by all four wartime allies, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and the city became a meeting point where intelligence officers from all sides could operate relatively freely. Intelligence officers from the CIA and KGB would sometimes encounter each other socially, attending the same diplomatic functions, frequenting the same restaurants and cultural events, maintaining polite fictions about their true work while each tried to identify the other's agents and operations. The CIA developed a program to support anti-communist groups in Eastern Europe, providing money, equipment, and training to organizations that opposed Soviet control. This included support for resistance movements in countries like Poland and Ukraine, where some people continued fighting against Soviet rule even after the war ended. The CIA also supported exile organizations based in Western Europe, groups of people who had fled communism and who maintained contact with networks inside their home countries. These programs had limited success, as the KGB was usually able to identify and suppress resistance groups, and some CIA-supported operations ended in disaster when agents were captured or killed. One of the CIA's most ambitious early operations involved Albania, where the agency worked with British intelligence to send teams of Albanian exiles back into their home country to organize resistance against the communist government. The operation was compromised from the beginning by Kim Philby, the Soviet agent within British intelligence, who provided the KGB with detailed information about the operation. The Albanian security services, working with KGB advisors, were waiting for the CIA-trained teams when they infiltrated into Albania, and most of the agents were captured or killed. The Albanian operation became a cautionary tale about the difficulties of covert action and the damage that a well-placed Soviet agent could cause. The CIA and KGB both invested heavily in developing technical capabilities for espionage during these years. The CIA created a technical services division that developed sophisticated devices for secret communication, for concealing messages and equipment, for surveillance, and for various other intelligence purposes. KGB technical services developed similar capabilities, creating hidden cameras, secret writing systems, encryption devices, and various tools that intelligence officers and agents could use in their work. Both organizations studied advances in chemistry, electronics, and other fields to find ways to apply new technology to intelligence operations. Intelligence gathering also involved analyzing open sources of information, material that was publicly available but that could reveal important details when examined carefully. Both the CIA and KGB employed analysts who studied newspapers, academic journals, technical publications, and other open sources from the other side, looking for clues about military capabilities, economic conditions, political developments, and technological advances. The Soviets were particularly thorough in collecting and analyzing Western publications, maintaining large staffs who read everything they could obtain and who looked for patterns and implications that might not be obvious to casual readers. The CIA established an extensive analytical capability, bringing together experts in various fields to study the Soviet Union and try to understand Soviet intentions and capabilities. These analysts worked with intelligence gathered by spies and by technical means, but they also drew on their expertise in Soviet politics, economics, military affairs, and culture to interpret the information and provide assessments to American policymakers. The analytical work was often as important as the espionage itself, because raw intelligence needed to be understood and placed in context before it could be useful for decision-making. As you rest quietly in the peaceful darkness, breathing slowly and deeply, you can sense how the intelligence competition in Europe was intensifying during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Both the CIA and KGB were building their capabilities, recruiting agents, conducting operations, and trying to gain advantage over the other. The work was patient and methodical, rarely producing dramatic breakthroughs but gradually accumulating information and influence. Intelligence officers lived double lives, maintaining cover identities while conducting secret operations, constantly aware that discovery could mean expulsion from the country they worked in, or, for agents working without diplomatic protection, arrest, imprisonment, or death. The CIA learned hard lessons during these early years about the difficulties of espionage against a closed totalitarian society like the Soviet Union and its satellites. The KGB's control over Eastern European societies made it extremely difficult to recruit and run agents there, and the KGB's own networks in the West gave it knowledge of CIA operations that allowed Soviet intelligence to counter many American efforts. The CIA also learned about the challenges of covert action, discovering that it was much easier to plan operations than to execute them successfully, particularly when the KGB was actively working to identify and defeat those operations. The KGB, meanwhile, was demonstrating considerable skill in recruiting Western agents, in conducting sophisticated operations, and in protecting Soviet secrets from Western intelligence. Soviet intelligence benefited from the ideological commitment of some of its agents, people who believed in communism and who spied for the Soviet Union out of conviction rather than for money. The KGB also benefited from its ruthlessness, its willingness to use methods that Western intelligence agencies hesitated to employ, though the CIA would sometimes adopt similar methods when it believed the situation required them. Berlin, the former capital of Nazi Germany, became perhaps the most important location for intelligence operations during the Cold War, a divided city where East met West, where the CIA and KGB operated in close proximity, where espionage was so common that the city earned a reputation as the spy capital of the world. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about this remarkable city and the intelligence war that was fought there for nearly 3 decades. After Germany's defeat in World War II, the country was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, though located deep inside the Soviet zone of occupation, was also divided into 4 sectors because of its symbolic importance as Germany's capital. This created an unusual situation where Western military forces and civilians maintained a presence far inside Soviet-controlled territory, creating opportunities for intelligence collection and for East Germans to escape to the West, but also creating vulnerabilities that the Soviets could exploit. The CIA established a major presence in Berlin immediately after the war, recognizing the city's importance as a listening post where American intelligence could observe Soviet activities, recruit agents from among Germans in the Soviet sector, and conduct operations into Eastern Europe. The KGB similarly established a strong presence in East Berlin, using it as a base for operations against the West and as a headquarters for controlling East German intelligence services. The two organizations operated within a few miles of each other, sometimes within sight of each other, creating a strange situation where adversaries could observe each other's headquarters but could not directly interfere with each other's operations because of the diplomatic protections that existed in occupied Berlin. As you sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine Berlin in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a city still bearing the scars of war, with bomb-damaged buildings and rubble-filled lots, but gradually beginning to recover. The Soviet sector and the Western sectors developed very differently, with the East becoming increasingly restricted and controlled while the West remained relatively open and free. East Berliners could initially move between sectors fairly easily, which allowed the CIA to recruit agents in the East who could provide information about Soviet activities and East German developments. It also allowed East Germans who were dissatisfied with communist rule to flee to the West, a flow of refugees that embarrassed the Soviet Union and created labor shortages in East Germany. One of the CIA's most ambitious technical operations took place in Berlin in the mid-1950s, a project called Operation Gold that involved digging a tunnel from West Berlin into the Soviet sector to tap into underground communications cables used by Soviet military forces and intelligence services. The tunnel was a remarkable engineering achievement, extending more than 1,500 feet from a building in the American sector into East Berlin, where it connected to the cables. The tunnel allowed the CIA and British intelligence to intercept thousands of telephone conversations and messages, providing valuable intelligence about Soviet military capabilities and plans. Operation Gold operated successfully for about a year, from 1955 to 1956, before the Soviets discovered the tunnel and exposed it publicly as an example of American espionage. The operation was considered a major CIA success because of the intelligence it provided, though it was later revealed that the KGB had known about the tunnel from its inception because George Blake, a British intelligence officer who was actually a Soviet agent, had provided information about the operation to his KGB handlers. The KGB allowed the tunnel to operate because they did not want to expose Blake, and because they could control what information passed through the cables to some degree, feeding disinformation to the CIA along with genuine intelligence. The Berlin Tunnel operation illustrated both the capabilities and the limitations of technical intelligence collection. The CIA could use sophisticated technology to intercept Soviet communications, but if those communications were themselves compromised or manipulated, the value of the intelligence was diminished. The operation also showed the importance of human intelligence, of having agents within the adversary's organization, as Blake's betrayal of the tunnel operation demonstrated how much damage a well-placed agent could cause. Berlin was also the scene of numerous agent recruitments and defections, as people moved between East and West, and intelligence services on both sides tried to turn them into sources of information. The CIA recruited agents among East Germans who had access to useful information and who traveled to West Berlin, where they could be approached safely. The KGB similarly recruited agents among West Berliners or among Western military personnel stationed in the city, offering money or exploiting personal vulnerabilities to turn them into Soviet spies. The most dramatic espionage activities in Berlin often involved defectors, people who decided to abandon their own side and seek refuge with the other, usually bringing intelligence information with them. The CIA established procedures for handling defectors from the Soviet Union or East Germany who made it to West Berlin, debriefing them extensively about what they knew, verifying their information, and helping them resettle in the West. The KGB similarly handled the much smaller number of Western defectors who chose to go to the East, though Soviet intelligence was always suspicious that such defectors might be plants sent by Western intelligence to spread disinformation. As you breathe slowly and peacefully, imagine the tension in Berlin as the 1950s progressed and as the divide between East and West became more pronounced. The flow of refugees from East to West Berlin continued and even accelerated, with thousands of East Germans fleeing communism every month, a visible demonstration that people preferred the Western system to the Soviet system. This refugee flow was a propaganda disaster for the Soviet Union and East Germany, and it created increasing pressure to do something to stop it. In August 1961, that pressure led to one of the Cold War's most dramatic developments when the East German government, with Soviet support, built the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier dividing East and West Berlin. The wall went up almost overnight, with East German workers stringing barbed wire and erecting concrete barriers along the border between the sectors, cutting streets in half, dividing neighborhoods, separating families. The wall would be expanded and reinforced over the following months and years into a formidable barrier with guard towers, minefields, and armed border guards who had orders to shoot anyone trying to cross without permission. The Berlin Wall changed the intelligence situation in the city dramatically. It became much more difficult for the CIA to recruit and handle agents in East Berlin when those agents could no longer simply walk into West Berlin for meetings. The CIA had to develop new methods for communicating with agents in the East, using secret hiding places for messages and materials, using coded signals, and occasionally arranging dangerous crossings of the wall for particularly valuable agents. The wall also made it much more difficult for East Germans to defect, though some managed to escape by tunneling under the wall, swimming across waterways, hiding in vehicles, or, in a few cases, crashing through border checkpoints. The KGB benefited from the wall because it reduced the flow of information from east to west and made it more difficult for Western intelligence to operate in East Berlin. But the wall was also a propaganda defeat for the Soviet Union, a visible admission that the communist system had to use force to prevent its own citizens from leaving. The famous phrase that President Kennedy spoke in Berlin in 1963, "Ich bin ein Berliner," Declaring solidarity with Berlin's residents resonated powerfully because it recognized the courage of West Berliners living in isolation deep inside communist territory and the suffering of East Berliners imprisoned by their own government. Berlin remained a center for intelligence operations throughout the Cold War, with both the CIA and KGB maintaining large presences in the city. But the nature of the operations changed after the wall went up. The CIA focused more on technical intelligence collection, on intercepting communications and signals rather than on recruiting agents who could no longer easily meet with their handlers. The agency also worked to help people escape from East Berlin and East Germany, seeing this as both a humanitarian activity and as a way to gain access to people who might have valuable information about conditions in the East. The KGB continued to use Berlin as a base for operations against the West, recruiting agents among Western military personnel and diplomats stationed in the city, conducting surveillance of American and British facilities and personnel, and supporting East German intelligence services in their own operations. Soviet intelligence maintained a large facility in Karlshorst, a district in East Berlin, where KGB officers worked alongside East German intelligence in a complex that became the headquarters for Soviet intelligence operations in Germany. Intelligence operations in Berlin sometimes turned deadly, with agents being captured and imprisoned, and occasionally with people being killed trying to escape from east to west or being executed after being caught spying. The CIA and KGB both lost personnel in Berlin over the years, intelligence officers whose covers were blown and who had to be evacuated quickly, and agents who were caught and who faced imprisonment or death. The human cost of the intelligence war was often hidden from public view, but it was real, affecting real people who took real risks. As you rest quietly, breathing slowly and deeply, completely relaxed, you can understand how Berlin symbolized the Cold War itself, a divided city where two systems confronted each other directly, where the competition between the CIA and KGB played out in concrete form with walls and barbed wire and guard towers. The city remained divided until 1989, when the wall finally came down and Berlin began to reunify, marking the beginning of the end of the Cold War and of the intelligence competition that had defined the city for so long. One of the most damaging and dramatic aspects of the intelligence war between the CIA and KGB involved double agents, people who pretended to work for one side while actually working for the other, and the betrayals that occurred when intelligence officers or agents switched sides or were revealed to have been secretly working for the enemy all along. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about these betrayals and what they meant for the intelligence war. A double agent is someone who appears to be spying for one intelligence service but who is actually controlled by another intelligence service and who provides that other service with information about the first service's operations, personnel, and methods. Double agents were valuable to both the CIA and KGB because they could reveal the adversary's intelligence operations, identify the adversary's agents, and feed disinformation to mislead the adversary about one's own capabilities and intentions. Both organizations invested significant effort in trying to create and run double agents, and both suffered when they discovered that people they trusted were actually working for the other side. The KGB was particularly successful at recruiting double agents within Western intelligence services and governments during the Cold War. Soviet intelligence had a long tradition of penetrating adversary organizations, dating back to the early days of the Soviet state, when communist parties in other countries provided ready-made networks of people ideologically committed to helping the Soviet Union. During the 1930s and 40s, Soviet intelligence recruited agents in Britain, the United States, and other Western countries, some of whom remained undetected for decades and provided enormously valuable intelligence to the Soviet Union. The most famous Soviet penetrations of Western intelligence involved the Cambridge Five, a group of British men who were recruited as Soviet agents while they were students at Cambridge University in the 1930s. When communist ideology had considerable appeal among some British intellectuals who were disillusioned with capitalism during the Great Depression and who saw the Soviet Union as representing a more just social system. These men went on to careers in British government and intelligence, rising to positions where they had access to highly classified information that they secretly provided to their Soviet handlers over many years. Kim Philby was the most successful of the Cambridge Five, rising to senior positions in British intelligence where he had access to British and American intelligence operations and where he was actually in charge of British intelligence's anti-Soviet operations for a time, giving him perfect knowledge of what the British were doing against the Soviets and allowing him to warn the KGB about operations that threatened Soviet interests. Philby provided the Soviets with information that compromised numerous intelligence operations and that led to the capture or death of agents working for the West. His betrayal went undetected for years, even as suspicions gradually accumulated, and he was not definitively exposed until 1963, when he fled to the Soviet Union rather than face arrest in Britain. As you sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine the damage that agents like Philby caused to Western intelligence operations. Every operation that Philby knew about was potentially compromised, every agent he knew about was at risk, every plan he saw could be countered by the Soviets. The discovery of his betrayal led to extensive investigations within British and American intelligence, reviewing every operation that Philby might have known about, trying to assess what damage he had caused, trying to understand how he had remained undetected for so long. The investigations also led to reforms in security procedures, including more extensive background checks, more careful compartmentalization of information so that no single person could know about too many operations, and more systematic counterintelligence efforts to detect potential traitors. The CIA suffered its own penetrations by Soviet intelligence, though these were not discovered until later in the Cold War. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who worked in counterintelligence, was actually a Soviet agent who provided the KGB with information about CIA operations and who identified numerous Soviet citizens who were working as CIA agents, leading to their arrest and execution. Ames worked for the Soviets for nearly a decade before being caught in 1994. Causing enormous damage to CIA operations and leading to major changes in how the agency handled security and counterintelligence. The KGB also suffered from defections and penetrations, though these were less common than Western intelligence's problems with Soviet agents. Some Soviet intelligence officers defected to the West, bringing with them valuable information about KGB operations, methods, and personnel. These defectors were extensively debriefed by the CIA and other Western intelligence services, providing insights into how Soviet intelligence operated and helping to identify KGB agents in the West. Some Soviet defectors were motivated by disillusionment with the Soviet system, while others defected for personal reasons or because they feared being caught for some transgression and wanted to escape punishment. One of the most valuable Soviet defectors was Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer who volunteered to work for British and American intelligence in the early 1960s. Penkovsky provided information about Soviet missile capabilities that proved crucial during the Cuban Missile Crisis, helping President Kennedy understand that the Soviet Union was not as strong as it claimed to be and giving Kennedy confidence to stand firm during the crisis. Penkovsky was eventually caught by the KGB and executed, but the intelligence he provided during the time he worked for the West was extraordinarily valuable. The CIA and KGB both struggled with the challenge of validating information provided by sources, particularly by defectors or volunteers who claimed to have valuable intelligence. Was the person genuinely offering to help, or were they actually a double agent sent by the other side to spread disinformation and identify friendly intelligence operations? Both organizations developed elaborate procedures for vetting sources, testing their information against other intelligence, looking for inconsistencies or signs of deception. Sometimes these procedures worked, catching double agents before they could cause serious damage, but sometimes double agents managed to pass the tests and operated successfully for years before being discovered. As you breathe slowly and peacefully, you can understand how the problem of double agents created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia within intelligence organizations, where people had to consider the possibility that their colleagues might be traitors, where information had to be carefully controlled and compartmented so that potential traitors could not access too much, where the hunt for moles, as double agents were sometimes called, could consume enormous resources and create internal divisions. Both the CIA and KGB experienced periods when counterintelligence concerns dominated the organization's attention, when suspicion fell on loyal officers who were then investigated extensively before being cleared. The hunt for Soviet agents within the CIA intensified during the 1960s and 70s under the leadership of James Angleton, who headed CIA counterintelligence for more than 2 decades. Angleton became convinced that the KGB had successfully penetrated the CIA at high levels and that many defectors from the Soviet Union were actually double agents sent to deceive American intelligence. His investigations paralyzed parts of the CIA's operations against the Soviet Union for years, as officers were investigated and operations were shut down based on suspicions that often proved unfounded. Angleton's own career ended in controversy, with some believing he had done valuable work protecting the CIA from Soviet penetration and others believing he had damaged the agency through excessive suspicion. The KGB similarly conducted investigations into potential Western penetrations of Soviet intelligence, though the closed nature of Soviet society and the KGB's control over Soviet citizens made it more difficult for Western intelligence to recruit Soviet agents in the first place. When the KGB did discover that one of its officers had been working for the West, the response was typically swift and brutal, with the traitor being arrested, tried in secret, and executed. The KGB used these cases as warnings to other officers about the consequences of betrayal, and the Soviet system's control over information meant that most Soviet citizens never learned about these cases unless the government chose to publicize them for propaganda purposes. The damage caused by double agents went beyond the specific operations that were compromised and the specific agents who were captured. Betrayals also damaged morale within intelligence organizations, created distrust among officers who had to wonder whether their colleagues might be traitors, and forced both the CIA and KGB to invest enormous resources in counterintelligence efforts that might otherwise have been directed toward collecting intelligence about the adversary. The psychological impact of betrayal was significant, affecting how intelligence officers viewed their work and their organization. In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time during the Cold War, and intelligence operations by both the CIA and KGB played crucial roles in creating the crisis, in managing it, and in resolving it. As you rest peacefully, breathing slowly and deeply, let me tell you about this dramatic episode and how the intelligence war between the CIA and KGB intersected with the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis had its roots in the CIA's operations against Cuba, where Fidel Castro had established a communist government in 1959 after leading a revolution that overthrew the American-supported Batista regime. The CIA had been involved in attempts to undermine Castro's government, including the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, when CIA-trained and equipped Cuban exiles attempted to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro but were quickly defeated. The invasion's failure was a significant embarrassment for the CIA and for President Kennedy, and it convinced Castro that the United States would continue trying to remove him from power. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity in Cuba, a chance to station Soviet nuclear missiles close to the United States in the same way that American missiles in Turkey were stationed close to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev believed that placing missiles in Cuba would deter further American attempts to overthrow Castro and would strengthen the Soviet Union's strategic position by putting American cities within reach of Soviet missiles that could arrive with only a few minutes' warning. The KGB was involved in supporting this operation, helping to establish Soviet military presence in Cuba, supporting Cuban intelligence services, and working to prevent the CIA from learning about the missile deployment until it was too late for the United States to do anything about it. The Soviet missile deployment to Cuba was conducted in great secrecy during the summer of 1962, with Soviet ships carrying missiles and military equipment across the Atlantic, while Soviet officials publicly denied that any offensive weapons were being placed in Cuba. The KGB worked to protect the secrecy of the operation, monitoring for any signs that American intelligence had discovered what was happening, taking measures to prevent leaks, and conducting deception operations to mislead the CIA about Soviet activities in Cuba. but the CIA was watching Cuba closely, concerned about reports of increased Soviet activity on the island. The agency conducted surveillance flights over Cuba using high-altitude U-2 aircraft equipped with sophisticated cameras that could photograph ground installations from 70,000 feet. In mid-October, one of these U-2 flights photographed Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, providing unmistakable evidence that the Soviet Union was deploying nuclear-capable missiles to the island despite Soviet denials. The discovery of the missiles created a crisis that dominated the Kennedy administration's attention for 13 days in October 1962. President Kennedy and his advisors, including CIA Director John McCone, debated how to respond to the Soviet missiles, weighing options that ranged from diplomacy to invasion. Intelligence played a crucial role throughout the crisis, as the CIA continued flying U-2 missions over Cuba to monitor construction of the missile sites, tracking how quickly the missiles were becoming operational, and providing updates that helped Kennedy understand what timeline he faced for taking action. As you breathe slowly and let yourself relax more deeply, imagine the tension during those 13 days, with American and Soviet forces on high alert, with nuclear war seeming possible, with intelligence operations continuing even as diplomats worked to find a peaceful resolution. The CIA provided Kennedy with detailed information about Soviet military capabilities, about the readiness of Soviet forces, about what might happen if the United States launched military strikes against the missile sites in Cuba. This intelligence helped Kennedy make informed decisions about how to respond, though the situation remained extremely dangerous and the outcome uncertain until the very end. The KGB, meanwhile, was working to understand American intentions and capabilities during the crisis, gathering intelligence about American military preparations, about what Kennedy might do, about whether the United States was actually preparing to invade Cuba or attack the Soviet Union. Soviet intelligence had sources within Western governments and close to American decision-making who provided information that helped Khrushchev understand the seriousness of the American response and the risks of allowing the crisis to escalate further. The crisis was ultimately resolved through a combination of diplomacy and secret negotiations, with Khrushchev agreeing to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. Intelligence operations played a role in these negotiations, with both sides using intelligence about the other's capabilities and intentions to inform their negotiating positions, and with some communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev being conducted through intelligence channels rather than through normal diplomatic means. One of the most important intelligence contributions during the crisis came from Oleg Penkovsky, the Soviet military intelligence officer who was secretly working for British and American intelligence. Penkovsky had provided the CIA with detailed information about Soviet missile capabilities and about the Soviet military's actual readiness, information that helped Kennedy understand that Soviet strategic forces were not as strong as the Soviet Union publicly claimed. This intelligence gave Kennedy confidence to stand firm during the crisis, knowing that the United States had significant military advantages if the crisis escalated to war, though Penkovsky himself was arrested by the KGB during the crisis and was later executed. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated both the value and the limitations of intelligence in international crises. Good intelligence had helped the CIA discover the Soviet missiles before they became operational, giving Kennedy time to respond. Intelligence about Soviet capabilities helped Kennedy understand his options and make informed decisions. But intelligence had also failed to predict that the Soviet Union would place missiles in Cuba in the first place, and the CIA's own operations against Cuba, particularly the Bay of Pigs invasion, had contributed to creating the situation that led Khrushchev to deploy the missiles. After the crisis ended, both the CIA and KGB conducted extensive analyses of what had happened, trying to understand how the crisis had developed, what intelligence successes and failures had occurred, and what lessons could be learned for future crises. The CIA examined why it had not predicted the Soviet missile deployment earlier, reviewing what intelligence had been available and whether it had been properly analyzed. The KGB examined how the missile deployment had been discovered, whether security had been adequate, and what might have been done differently. The crisis also led to changes in how both superpowers managed their intelligence operations and their diplomatic communications. The establishment of the hotline between Washington and Moscow after the crisis reflected recognition that better communication was needed during emergencies, when rapid exchange of messages could help prevent misunderstandings that might lead to war. Both the CIA and KGB expanded their capabilities for providing rapid intelligence assessments during crises, recognizing that leaders needed timely information to make decisions under pressure. The Cuban Missile Crisis remained for decades the most dramatic example of how close the Cold War came to turning into a hot war, and intelligence operations by both the CIA and KGB had played significant roles in creating, managing, and resolving the crisis. The crisis also illustrated how intelligence agencies could influence international events in ways that went beyond simply gathering information, how their covert operations could create situations that threatened to spiral out of control, and how the competition between intelligence services was not just an abstract game but something with real and potentially catastrophic consequences. Beyond Europe and Cuba, the CIA and KGB conducted covert operations in countries across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, attempting to influence political developments, support friendly governments, undermine adversaries, and gain advantage in the global competition between the superpowers. As you rest comfortably and breathe slowly, let me tell you about these operations around the world and how the intelligence war between the CIA and KGB played out in dozens of countries. The CIA conducted numerous covert operations during the Cold War aimed at preventing countries from falling under communist influence or at overthrowing governments that were considered hostile to American interests. These operations varied widely in their methods and their success. Some involved providing financial and technical support to political parties or labor unions that opposed communist influence. Others involved propaganda operations designed to shape public opinion. Some operations involved paramilitary activities, supporting armed groups fighting against communist governments or movements. and in a few cases, CIA operations involved plotting or assisting in the overthrow of governments through coups. One of the earliest and most controversial CIA covert operations took place in Iran in 1953, when the agency worked with British intelligence to help overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil industry. The operation, code-named Arjux, involved paying Iranians to participate in demonstrations and riots, working with military officers to organize a coup, and conducting propaganda operations to undermine Mossadegh's popular support. The operation succeeded in removing Mossadegh from power and restoring the Shah of Iran to full control, but it created lasting resentment in Iran and contributed to the anti-American sentiment that would eventually lead to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The following year, 1954, the CIA conducted a similar operation in Guatemala, where the agency organized and supported the overthrow of President Jacobo Arbenz, whose land reform policies threatened American commercial interests and whom the CIA believed was moving Guatemala toward communism. The Guatemala operation involved propaganda, economic pressure, and support for a small military force that invaded from neighboring Honduras. The operation succeeded in removing Arbenz from power, but it also began a period of instability and violence in Guatemala that lasted for decades. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine how these covert operations were planned and executed, with CIA officers working in secret, recruiting local allies, moving money and equipment, trying to influence events while remaining hidden in the background. The operations required careful planning, knowledge of local conditions, and usually collaboration with people in the target country who were willing to work with the CIA for various reasons, including money, ideology, or their own political ambitions. The KGB conducted similar covert operations around the world, supporting communist parties and movements, providing arms and training to revolutionary groups, and working to undermine Western influence. Soviet intelligence was particularly active in supporting national liberation movements in Africa and Asia, seeing these movements as natural allies against Western colonialism and capitalism. The KGB provided weapons, training, and financial support to groups fighting against colonial rule or against governments aligned with the West, sometimes helping these groups conduct guerrilla warfare or terrorism. In Africa, both the CIA and KGB were involved in supporting opposing sides in various conflicts during the 1960s and 70s as former European colonies gained independence and new governments formed. In the Congo, the CIA supported Mobutu Seko in his rise to power, seeing him as preferable to Patrice Lumumba, the country's first prime minister, whom American officials believed was too closely aligned with the Soviet Union. The KGB, meanwhile, supported Lumumba and other African leaders who embraced socialist ideology and who opposed Western influence. In Southeast Asia, the CIA conducted extensive operations during the Vietnam War and related conflicts in Laos and Cambodia. In Laos, the CIA supported a secret war involving Hong fighters who fought against communist forces, an operation that lasted more than a decade and that involved tens of thousands of fighters but that remained largely hidden from the American public. In Vietnam, the CIA conducted operations aimed at disrupting communist forces, gathering intelligence about North Vietnamese activities, and supporting the South Vietnamese government. The KGB supported North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, providing intelligence support, training, and equipment. In Latin America, both the CIA and KGB competed for influence throughout the Cold War. After Castro's revolution established a communist government in Cuba, both superpowers worried about similar revolutions occurring in other Latin American countries. The CIA supported anti-communist governments and opposition groups, conducted operations aimed at preventing leftist movements from gaining power, and worked to counter Cuban and Soviet influence in the region. The KGB supported revolutionary movements, provided assistance to governments that aligned with the Soviet Union, and conducted intelligence operations to understand and counter American activities. One of the most controversial CIA operations in Latin America involved Chile, where the agency worked to prevent Salvador Allende, a socialist politician, from taking power, and then, after Allende became president through democratic elections, supported opposition groups and military officers who eventually overthrew his government in a coup in 1973. The Chilean operation raised serious questions about whether the CIA should be involved in overthrowing democratically elected governments, even when those governments pursued policies that the United States opposed. As you rest quietly, breathing slowly and peacefully, you can understand how these covert operations around the world were part of the larger Cold War competition, with the CIA and KGB fighting proxy battles through local allies, trying to influence which countries would be aligned with the Western Bloc or the Soviet Bloc, supporting friendly governments and undermining hostile ones. The operation sometimes achieved their immediate objectives, changing who held power or preventing adversaries from achieving their goals, but they also often created unintended consequences, generating resentment against the superpowers who were manipulating local politics, contributing to instability and violence, and sometimes producing outcomes that both sides would later regret. The covert operations conducted by the CIA and KGB raised difficult moral and legal questions about what intelligence agencies should be permitted to do in pursuing their nation's interests. Should intelligence agencies be involved in overthrowing governments? Should they support armed groups who might commit human rights violations? Should they conduct operations that might kill people, even if those people were adversaries? Different people answered these questions differently, with some believing that the existential nature of the Cold War justified extreme measures and others believing that democratic societies should impose strict limits on what their intelligence agencies could do even in pursuit of national security. Both the CIA and KGB experienced failures in their covert operations, operations that were exposed or that produced disastrous results. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a major CIA failure that damaged the agency's reputation and led to reforms in how operations were planned and approved. The KGB also experienced failures, including operations where agents were caught, where plans were discovered before they could be executed, or where operations produced results opposite to what was intended. Both organizations learned from these failures, improving their methods and procedures, though both continued to conduct covert operations throughout the Cold War despite the risks. The covert operations conducted by both organizations remained mostly secret during the Cold War, with the public knowing little about what the CIA and KGB were doing around the world. Some operations were eventually revealed through investigative journalism, through defectors who disclosed information, or through government investigations and declassification of documents. These revelations often produced controversy and debate about whether the operations had been justified, whether they had served their nation's interests, and whether intelligence agencies should be subject to greater oversight and accountability. The competition between the CIA and KGB was not limited to human intelligence, to recruiting agents and conducting covert operations. Both organizations also invested heavily in technical means of intelligence collection, developing sophisticated technologies for surveillance, communications interception, and various other methods of gathering information without relying on human sources. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about this technological dimension of the intelligence war. Signals intelligence, the interception and analysis of communications and electronic signals, became increasingly important as the Cold War progressed and as both superpowers relied more heavily on radio, telephone, and other electronic communications for military and diplomatic purposes. The United States established the National Security Agency, the NSA, in 1952 to centralize signals intelligence efforts, and the agency worked closely with the CIA to provide intelligence about Soviet and other adversaries' communications. The Soviet Union had its own signals intelligence capabilities, with organizations within the KGB and military intelligence conducting similar operations against Western communications. Both sides established listening posts around the world to intercept the other's communications, positioning antennas and receivers near borders, on ships, and in embassies to collect signals from radar, radio transmissions, telephone networks, and other sources. The CIA and NSA operated listening stations in countries near the Soviet Union, including Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, where they could intercept Soviet military communications and radar signals. The KGB and Soviet military intelligence operated similar facilities near Western countries and along Soviet borders to collect signals from NATO military forces and communications. The development of satellite technology opened new possibilities for technical intelligence collection, allowing both superpowers to observe the other from space without requiring physical presence in or near the adversary's territory. The United States developed reconnaissance satellites in the 1960s that could photograph Soviet military installations from orbit, providing information about Soviet missile sites, military bases, naval facilities, and other strategic targets. These satellites gradually replaced the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft that had been used for the same purpose but that were vulnerable to being shot down, as happened when a Soviet surface-to-air missile brought down a U-2 piloted by France's Gary Powers over the Soviet Union in 1960. The Soviet Union developed its own reconnaissance satellites, though Soviet technology in this area lagged somewhat behind American capabilities. Soviet satellites photographed American military installations and monitored American military activities, though the satellites' capabilities were generally less sophisticated than their American counterparts. Both superpowers also developed satellites for signals intelligence, positioning receivers in orbit that could intercept radio transmissions and communications from the Earth below. As you sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine the enormous technological effort involved in developing these systems, the satellites and ground stations, the computers and cameras, the analysts and engineers who made it all work. The technical intelligence programs consumed billions of dollars and employed thousands of people, representing a major commitment of resources to the intelligence competition. The information these systems provided was crucial for understanding the adversary's military capabilities, for verifying arms control agreements, and for providing warning of potential attacks. The CIA developed Technical Services Division that created sophisticated devices for intelligence operations, including hidden cameras and microphones for surveillance, encryption systems for secure communications, secret writing and concealment systems for passing messages and materials, and various other tools that intelligence officers and agents could use. The agency invested in research and development, working with scientists and engineers to apply emerging technologies to intelligence purposes, sometimes in collaboration with private companies and sometimes in secret government laboratories. The KGB similarly developed technical capabilities, creating devices and systems for surveillance, communications, and various intelligence operations. Soviet technology was sometimes less sophisticated than American technology, reflecting the Soviet Union's generally lower level of technological development in electronics and other fields. But Soviet engineers were creative and persistent, often finding ways to accomplish intelligence objectives with simpler, more robust technology that could function reliably in difficult conditions. Both organizations made extensive use of surveillance technology to monitor diplomats, suspected agents, and other people of interest. In Moscow, the KGB maintained extensive surveillance of the American embassy and American diplomats, using hidden microphones to listen to conversations, monitoring telephone calls, following diplomats when they traveled around the city, and making it extremely difficult for CIA officers to operate or to meet with agents without being observed. In Washington and other American cities, the FBI conducted similar surveillance of Soviet diplomats and suspected intelligence officers, though American surveillance was generally less extensive and intrusive than what the KGB conducted in the Soviet Union. The discovery of surveillance devices in embassies and other locations was a recurring problem for both sides. The Soviets were particularly skilled at planting listening devices in the American embassy in Moscow, concealing microphones in walls, furniture, and even in gifts presented to American diplomats. One famous case involved a wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States that was presented to the American ambassador by Soviet school children and that hung in the ambassador's office for years before being discovered to contain a sophisticated listening device that could be activated by beaming radio signals at it from outside the building. The CIA also conducted technical surveillance operations, though generally with less success in penetrating Soviet facilities than the KGB achieved against American facilities. American intelligence did succeed in placing listening devices in some Soviet installations and in intercepting Soviet communications through various technical means, but Soviet security was generally effective at detecting and removing American surveillance devices when they were discovered. As you breathe slowly and peacefully, you can appreciate how the technological dimension of intelligence collection complemented human intelligence operations, providing information that could not be obtained through agents and sources. Technical intelligence could reveal military capabilities, track troop movements, intercept communications, and provide warning of potential threats. But technical intelligence also had limitations, as it could not reveal intentions or motivations, could not provide insight into leadership thinking, and could be countered through encryption, communication security, and deception measures. Both the CIA and KGB worked constantly to improve their technical capabilities while also working to protect their own communications and activities from the adversary's technical collection. This created an ongoing competition in encryption and communication security, with each side developing more sophisticated methods to protect information while simultaneously working to break the other side's encryption and communication security. The competition drove advances in computer technology, cryptography, and various other fields that would eventually have applications far beyond intelligence. The CIA and KGB also competed in developing methods for secret communication with agents, creating systems that would allow intelligence officers and agents to exchange messages and materials without being detected by the adversary's surveillance. These systems included dead drops, secret hiding places where messages or materials could be left for retrieval, signal sites where agents could indicate they had information to pass or needed to meet, and various other methods that relied on tradecraft rather than technology to evade detection. Technical intelligence collection raised legal and ethical questions similar to those raised by covert operations, particularly regarding the interception of communications and the surveillance of people. Different countries had different legal frameworks governing intelligence collection, with some imposing strict limits and others allowing intelligence agencies broad authority. The balance between security and privacy, between the government's need for information and individuals' rights to be free from surveillance, remained contentious throughout the Cold War and continues to be debated today. Beyond espionage and covert operations, the competition between the CIA and KGB included extensive efforts to influence public opinion, to shape how people in different countries thought about the Cold War, and to conduct what was called psychological warfare aimed at undermining the adversary's credibility and legitimacy. As you rest quietly and breathe slowly, let me tell you about these propaganda and psychological warfare operations and how they were part of the broader intelligence competition. Propaganda, the deliberate shaping of information to influence public opinion, was considered an important tool by both the CIA and KGB, and both organizations conducted extensive propaganda operations during the Cold War. These operations ranged from relatively straightforward information programs to more sophisticated and deceptive campaigns involving disinformation, forged documents, and manipulation of media and cultural institutions. The goal was to influence how people thought about the superpowers and their respective systems, to build support for one's own side while undermining support for the adversary. The CIA conducted propaganda operations through various means, including support for publications, radio broadcasts, cultural organizations, and individual journalists and intellectuals. The agency established and funded publications in Europe and other regions that promoted democratic values and criticized communism, sometimes openly acknowledging American support and sometimes concealing the CIA's role. The agency also supported Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, broadcasting services that transmitted news and information into communist countries where state-controlled media provided only propaganda approved by communist governments. These radio services were valuable tools for reaching audiences behind the Iron Curtain, providing information about events in the West and about developments within communist countries that official media ignored or distorted. The broadcasts helped people in communist countries understand that alternative sources of information existed, that the official narrative was not the only narrative, and that the outside world was different from how communist propaganda portrayed it. The Soviet Union and its allies worked to jam these broadcasts, trying to prevent their citizens from hearing them, but many people managed to listen despite the jamming. The CIA also supported cultural organizations and programs designed to promote American and Western cultural values and to provide alternatives to Soviet cultural influence. The agency provided funding for magazines, conferences, art exhibitions, and other cultural activities that promoted democratic ideas and showcased Western cultural achievements. Some of these programs were conducted openly, with the American government's role acknowledged, while others involved secret CIA funding channeled through foundations and intermediaries so that the government's hand remained hidden. The KGB conducted similar propaganda operations, though Soviet propaganda tended to be more centrally controlled and coordinated than American efforts. The Soviet Union maintained extensive propaganda apparatus through official government agencies, the Communist Party's International Department, and intelligence services. Soviet propaganda emphasized themes of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, and peace, portraying the Soviet Union as defender of oppressed peoples against Western colonialism and exploitation, as an advocate for disarmament and peaceful coexistence, and as a superior social system that provided economic security and social justice. As you breathe slowly and sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine how this propaganda war played out in different countries and regions, with both sides competing to influence public opinion, to recruit supporters, to shape how people understood the Cold War and the choice between Western democracy and Soviet communism. In Western Europe, where communist parties had significant popular support in some countries, both the CIA and KGB worked to influence elections, support friendly political parties, and shape public debate about NATO, nuclear weapons, and relations with the Soviet Union. In developing countries, where many nations were newly independent and where populations often harbored resentment about past colonial rule by Western powers, Soviet propaganda emphasized anti-imperialism and positioned the Soviet Union as supporter of national liberation movements and opponent of Western exploitation. The CIA countered with its own propaganda emphasizing themes of freedom and democracy, highlighting Soviet repression of dissent and Soviet control over Eastern European countries that had little independence or sovereignty. Both organizations conducted disinformation operations, deliberately spreading false information to deceive and mislead adversaries and to influence public opinion. Disinformation could involve forging documents purporting to show that the adversary was engaged in nefarious activities, planting false stories in media outlets, or spreading rumors designed to damage the adversary's reputation. The KGB was particularly active in disinformation, conducting numerous operations over the years that involved forged documents, planted stories, and deliberate deception. One notable KGB disinformation operation in the 1980s involved spreading the false claim that the AIDS virus had been created in American biological warfare laboratories as a weapon, a claim that had no factual basis but that received considerable attention in some countries and that fed existing suspicions about American military research. The CIA also conducted disinformation operations, though American operations tended to be somewhat more constrained by concerns about credibility and by the need to maintain relationships with media and other institutions that might discover and expose false information. The competition in propaganda and psychological warfare reflected the broader ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, between democracy and authoritarianism, that defined the Cold War. Both sides believed that winning the battle for hearts and minds was crucial to prevailing in the larger conflict, that influencing how people thought about the competing systems mattered as much as military capabilities or economic strength. The extensive propaganda efforts by both sides contributed to the polarization of world opinion during the Cold War, with many people seeing the conflict in stark terms of good versus evil, though the reality was more complex and nuanced than either side's propaganda admitted. Propaganda operations sometimes backfired when they were discovered or when they became too heavy-handed and obvious, as audiences became skeptical of information that seemed designed to manipulate them. The CIA's credibility was damaged when its role in funding various cultural and media organizations was exposed in the late 1960s, leading to public criticism and to reforms in how the agency conducted such operations. Soviet propaganda often suffered from being too crude and obvious, with state-controlled media making claims that people could easily recognize as distortions or lies. As you rest peacefully, breathing slowly and deeply, you can appreciate how the propaganda war was an important dimension of the CIA-KGB competition, representing efforts to win the battle for public opinion and to shape how the Cold War was understood and interpreted. The propaganda activities of both organizations contributed to how millions of people around the world understood the conflict between the superpowers, though distinguishing between propaganda and genuine information was often difficult, and separating truth from manipulation required critical thinking and access to diverse sources of information. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Cold War had been continuing for more than 3 decades, and both the CIA and KGB were experiencing changes in their operations, their priorities, and their internal cultures. As you breathe slowly and rest comfortably, let me tell you about these later years of the intelligence competition and how both organizations adapted to changing circumstances. The CIA in the 1970s faced increased scrutiny and criticism in the wake of revelations about past operations that were considered questionable or improper. Congressional investigations led by Senator Frank Church and Representative Otis Pike examined CIA activities and revealed information about assassination plots against foreign leaders, about domestic surveillance that violated the agency's charter, about drug experiments conducted on unwitting subjects, and about various other activities that shocked many Americans and damaged the CIA's reputation. These investigations led to reforms including creation of permanent congressional oversight committees, establishment of clearer rules about what the CIA could and could not do, and requirements for presidential approval of covert operations. The reforms of the 1970s created more accountability but also made it more difficult for the CIA to conduct some types of operations, as there were now more reviews, more approvals required, more people who needed to be informed about operations. Some CIA officers felt that the reforms went too far, that they hampered the agency's ability to conduct effective operations against the Soviet Union and other adversaries. Others believed the reforms were necessary and overdue, that the CIA had strayed from its proper mission and needed to be reined in and made more accountable to elected officials and the public. The KGB in the same period was experiencing its own internal challenges, though these were different from the CIA's. The Soviet system's increasing economic difficulties in the 1970s and 80s created pressure throughout Soviet society, including within the KGB. The agency remained powerful and well-resourced by Soviet standards, but there was growing awareness among some KGB officers that the Soviet system was struggling, that the competition with the West was not going as well as Soviet propaganda claimed, and that the gap between the Soviet Union and Western countries was widening rather than narrowing. Some KGB officers who defected to the West during this period reported disillusionment with the Soviet system, describing their gradual recognition that much of what they had been told about the superiority of communism was false, that living standards in the West were higher than in the Soviet Union, that Western democracies were not the oppressive systems that Soviet propaganda portrayed them as. These defections provided valuable intelligence to the CIA about KGB operations and about conditions within the Soviet Union, but they also represented failures in Soviet security and ideological control. As you sink deeper into peaceful rest, imagine how both organizations continued their competition even as doubts and questions accumulated. The CIA and KGB still recruited agents, still conducted operations, still gathered intelligence, still competed for advantage in dozens of countries. But there was also a sense, particularly by the 1980s, that the Cold War had become a stalemate, that neither side was going to achieve decisive victory, that the competition would continue indefinitely unless something fundamental changed. The election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980 led to an intensification of American Cold War policy, including increased defense spending and a more aggressive approach to competing with the Soviet Union. The CIA's budget and activities expanded, with renewed emphasis on supporting anti-communist movements around the world, on conducting covert operations against Soviet interests, and on gathering intelligence about Soviet military capabilities and economic weaknesses. The agency supported Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, who were fighting against Soviet forces that had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. This operation, which involved providing weapons and training to the resistance, became one of the CIA's largest covert operations of the Cold War. The KGB responded to the more aggressive American policy with its own intensified activities, increasing surveillance of American diplomats and suspected intelligence officers, conducting operations against American interests, and working to counter CIA operations around the world. But the KGB was also dealing with the reality of Soviet economic decline and with the challenges of maintaining an extensive intelligence apparatus when resources were becoming scarcer. The Soviet Union was spending enormous amounts on its military and intelligence services while its economy was stagnating and its people were experiencing declining living standards. The accession of Mikhail Gorbachev to leadership of the Soviet Union in 1985 brought significant changes to Soviet policy, including policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, that were intended to reform and revitalize the Soviet system. These policies affected the KGB, which found itself having to adapt to a somewhat more open Soviet society where dissent was no longer suppressed as harshly as it had been previously. Some KGB officers supported Gorbachev's reforms, believing they were necessary to save the Soviet system, while others opposed the reforms as dangerous weakening of the state's control. The CIA watched these developments in the Soviet Union with great interest, trying to understand whether Gorbachev's reforms represented genuine change or merely tactical adjustments, whether the Soviet Union was truly weakening or whether this was a temporary phase before renewed Soviet assertiveness. The agency provided intelligence assessments to American leaders about Soviet capabilities and intentions, though there was disagreement among analysts about how to interpret Gorbachev's policies and about whether the Soviet Union was approaching collapse or merely experiencing temporary difficulties. As you breathe slowly and peacefully, you can appreciate how the late Cold War period was characterized by both continuity and change. The CIA and KGB continued their competition much as they had for decades, conducting operations, recruiting agents, gathering intelligence. But underneath this continuity, changes were occurring that would eventually transform the situation fundamentally. The Soviet system was weakening economically and losing legitimacy politically. The reforms that Gorbachev attempted would ultimately undermine the system he was trying to save rather than strengthening it. And the intelligence competition that had defined the CIA and KGB's relationship for 4 decades was approaching an end that few people anticipated. Both organizations had experienced successes and failures over the decades, had achieved some objectives while falling short on others, had demonstrated capabilities and suffered from limitations. The intelligence war had influenced many events and outcomes during the Cold War, though it was often difficult to measure exactly how much influence intelligence operations had compared to other factors like economic strength, military capabilities, and ideological appeal. What was clear was that the CIA and KGB had been central actors in the Cold War, that their competition had been intense and sustained, and that both organizations had shaped and been shaped by the conflict they were part of. As the 1980s drew to a close, events began to unfold with remarkable speed that would fundamentally change the world and bring the Cold War to an end. As you rest peacefully, breathing slowly and deeply, completely relaxed, let me tell you about the end of the Soviet Union and what it meant for the intelligence competition between the CIA and KGB. The Soviet Union's economic difficulties had been building for years, masked by propaganda and by the state's control over information, but becoming increasingly undeniable even to Soviet leaders. Gorbachev's attempts at reform, intended to revitalize the Soviet system, instead unleashed forces that the Soviet government could not control. As censorship relaxed, people began speaking more openly about problems that had been hidden or denied. As the Communist Party's monopoly on power weakened, alternative political movements began to emerge. As the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe loosened, the countries that had been forced into the Soviet bloc began asserting their independence. In 1989, a wave of revolution swept across Eastern Europe as communist governments fell one after another. Poland elected a non-communist government. Hungary opened its borders, allowing East Germans to flee to the west. Czechoslovakia's communist government collapsed in the Velvet Revolution. Most dramatically, the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, as East German authorities opened the border crossings and crowds of people poured through, celebrating the end of the barrier that had divided the city for 28 years. By the end of the year, communist governments had fallen across Eastern Europe, and Soviet forces were withdrawing or preparing to withdraw from countries they had occupied since World War II. The CIA had provided intelligence about the developing situation in Eastern Europe, reporting on the growing protests and political movements, on the weakening of communist governments, on the possibility that the Soviet bloc might collapse. But even the CIA was surprised by the speed with which events unfolded in 1989, as decades of communist control dissolved in a matter of months. Intelligence can provide information about trends and developments, but predicting exactly when and how major historical changes will occur is extraordinarily difficult, and the CIA, like most observers, did not fully anticipate the rapid collapse of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. The KGB found itself in an increasingly difficult position as the Soviet Union itself began to fracture. The organization that had been tasked with protecting the Soviet system now watched that system coming apart. Some KGB officers supported efforts to preserve the Soviet Union through reforms, believing that controlled change was possible. Others opposed the reforms and longed for a return to more authoritarian control. And some simply tried to protect their own positions and interests as the future became increasingly uncertain. In August 1991, hardliners within the Soviet government, including senior KGB officials, attempted a coup against Gorbachev, hoping to reverse the reforms and restore more traditional Soviet control. The coup failed when military units refused to support it and when Russian leader Boris Yeltsin rallied popular opposition against the coup plotters. The failed coup accelerated the Soviet Union's collapse rather than preventing it, as republics within the Soviet Union declared independence and the central government's authority evaporated. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, replaced by 15 independent countries, including Russia as the largest successor state. The end of the Soviet Union meant the end of the KGB as it had existed. The organization was broken up, with its various functions divided among several successor agencies in Russia and in other former Soviet republics. The Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, known as the SVR, inherited much of the KGB's foreign intelligence functions, while other agencies took over internal security, border control, and other responsibilities. Many former KGB officers found themselves without positions or transferred to the new agencies, while others left government service entirely. The CIA faced its own challenges in adapting to the post-Cold War world. The organization that had been created primarily to compete with the Soviet Union now had to redefine its mission and priorities. The end of the Cold War brought calls for reducing intelligence spending, for cutting the size of the intelligence community, for redirecting resources to other priorities now that the Soviet threat was gone. The CIA did reduce its size and budget in the early 1990s, though it also took on new responsibilities including counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, and monitoring weapons proliferation. As you breathe slowly and rest peacefully, you can reflect on the legacy of the intelligence competition between the CIA and KGB that had lasted for more than 4 decades. The competition had influenced numerous events during the Cold War, had involved thousands of intelligence officers and agents, had cost billions of dollars, and had sometimes turned deadly. Both organizations had achieved successes and suffered failures, had demonstrated impressive capabilities and experienced significant limitations, had served their nations while also sometimes acting in ways that compromised the values those nations claimed to represent. The intelligence competition had contributed to the Cold War's intensity, providing both sides with information about the other's capabilities and intentions, but also feeding suspicions and fears, encouraging covert operations that sometimes destabilized regions, and creating a climate of secrecy and deception that affected how both superpowers operated. Intelligence operations had influenced the Cuban Missile Crisis, various coups and interventions around the world, and countless smaller events that shaped Cold War history. But intelligence alone had not determined the Cold War's outcome, which resulted from larger forces including economic strength, ideological appeal, and the fundamental sustainability of the competing systems. The end of the Soviet Union was not primarily caused by CIA operations, though American pressure and the costs of competing with the United States contributed to Soviet economic difficulties. The Soviet system collapsed mainly because of its own internal contradictions and failures, because it could not provide the living standards that its people desired, because it could not maintain legitimacy in an increasingly interconnected world where comparisons with more successful systems were unavoidable, and because its rigid political structure could not adapt quickly enough to changing circumstances. Russia and the United States continued to maintain intelligence services after the Cold War ended, and the Russian intelligence services, though smaller and less resourced than the KGB had been, continued to conduct operations against the United States and its allies. the relationship between American and Russian intelligence became more complex, with episodes of cooperation on issues like counterterrorism mixed with continued suspicion and occasional conflicts. The methods and operations evolved, but the fundamental dynamic of nations gathering intelligence about potential adversaries continued. The history of the CIA and KGB during the Cold War offers lessons about intelligence, about international competition, and about the challenges of operating secret organizations within democratic and authoritarian systems. Intelligence can provide valuable information that helps leaders make informed decisions, but it cannot eliminate uncertainty or guarantee good outcomes. Covert operations can achieve tactical successes but can also produce unintended consequences and moral compromises. The secrecy necessary for intelligence work can protect sources and methods but can also enable abuses and reduce accountability. As you rest in deep peace now, breathing slowly and steadily, completely relaxed and comfortable, you can appreciate that the story of the CIA and KGB is part of the larger story of the Cold War, a conflict that shaped the second half of the 20th century and that continues to influence the world today. The intelligence competition between these organizations was conducted largely in secret, with most people knowing little about what was happening in the shadows. But the competition was real and consequential, affecting events large and small, involving real people who took real risks, and contributing to a global conflict that could have ended in catastrophic war but that instead concluded peacefully with one system collapsing and the other enduring. The lessons of this history remain relevant as nations continue to conduct intelligence operations, to compete for influence, to guard secrets and to seek the secrets of others. The methods and technologies have changed, becoming more sophisticated in many ways, but the fundamental nature of intelligence work continues. And the challenges of balancing security with liberty, secrecy with accountability, national interest with ethical conduct, remain as difficult now as they were during the Cold War. Sleep now, dear friend, knowing that the story of the CIA and KGB belongs to history, that the intense competition between these organizations has ended though intelligence work continues in new forms. Rest peacefully, understanding that you have learned about an important chapter in 20th century history, about the silent war that was fought in the shadows while the world above lived in the long twilight struggle between systems and ideologies. Tomorrow you will wake refreshed, carrying this knowledge with you, but tonight there is only rest, only peace, only the gentle embrace of sleep.